What if the greatest architectural achievement in American history was not built in 3 years, but discovered, excavated, and presented as new construction to hide the fact that it had always been there? What if the 1871 Great Chicago Fire was not an accident, but a controlled demolition designed to clear away evidence of buildings that should not have existed? And what if the world's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was the final moment when the public could see advanced pre-existing architecture before it was systematically destroyed and erased from official memory? In 1893, Chicago unveiled what newspapers called the greatest wonder of the modern age. A sprawling metropolis of neoclassical palaces, towering structures, intricate fountains, and electrical marvels that covered more than 600 acres. The White City, as it was called, attracted 27 million visitors in 6 months. They walked through buildings that seemed to belong to ancient Rome, illuminated by electric lights that turned night into day, powered by systems that demonstrated wireless transmission, remote control, and energy generation technologies that official history claims would not be developed for decades. Then, within months of the Exposition closing, nearly every structure was demolished, burned, buried, or dismantled with a speed and thoroughness that seemed almost frantic. Official explanations claimed the buildings were always temporary, built from plaster and wood, designed to last only for the fair's duration. But photographs tell a different story. Foundations sunk into bedrock, structural elements of stone and steel, construction quality and architectural sophistication inconsistent with disposable exhibition halls. What if the buildings were not temporary at all? What if they were permanent structures from a previous civilization, damaged by the 1871 fire, excavated and restored for the Exposition, then deliberately destroyed afterward to prevent questions about who had really built them and when? What if the fair was not a celebration of progress, but a farewell? The last public viewing of Tartarian architecture before its erasure was complete. The evidence exists. In the photographs they could not destroy, in the timelines that do not add up, in the construction techniques they could not explain, in the technology that should not have been possible, and in the testimonies of those who saw, who questioned, who refused to accept the official story. The 1893 Chicago Exposition was not what we have been told. And once we examine what it really was, the entire narrative of American history begins to unravel. Let us begin with the timeline, because nothing about the construction of the White City makes sense according to official chronology. In 1890, Chicago won the bid to host the world's Columbian Exposition. Construction supposedly began in 1891. The fair opened in May of 1893. This gives approximately 2 years for the design, planning, and construction of more than 200 buildings covering 600 acres, including massive structures like the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which covered 31 acres under a single roof and was at the time the largest building ever constructed. 2 years. To design from scratch, manufacture materials, transport them to site, excavate foundations, pour concrete, erect structural frames, install plumbing and electrical systems, create architectural ornamentation, landscape grounds, build infrastructure, and finish interiors for hundreds of buildings. Modern construction projects of far smaller scope require longer timelines even with computer modeling, prefabrication, mechanized equipment, and industrial supply chains. The official explanation is that the buildings were temporary, constructed from a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber, applied over wooden frames. This supposedly allowed for rapid construction, but this explanation collapses under examination. Photographs show buildings with stone foundations sunk 15 to 20 feet into bedrock. Massive load-bearing columns that could not have been wooden frames covered in plaster. Structural systems designed for permanence, not temporary display. Eyewitnesses describe the construction process, and their accounts are revealing. They do not describe building from the ground up. They describe excavation, uncovering, restoration. Workers reported finding buildings buried under accumulated dirt and debris. They reported cleaning existing structures rather than constructing new ones. They reported discovering intact foundations, existing utility tunnels, and pre-existing infrastructure that was incorporated into the fair rather than built for it. These accounts were dismissed. The official narrative insisted that everything was new, But the photographs preserve what the official records tried to obscure. Images labeled as construction in progress show buildings that appear complete, merely being cleaned. Supposed scaffolding that looks like excavation equipment. Workers not building walls but removing debris from existing structures. And then there is the problem of expertise. The architectural sophistication of the Exposition buildings required master craftsmen, engineers, and artisans with decades of experience in classical design. Where did these workers come from? How were thousands of skilled specialists assembled in Chicago within months? How did they coordinate across hundreds of projects to create stylistic unity? The official story provides no answer because there is no reasonable answer, unless the designs already existed, unless the workers were not creating but restoring, unless the fair was not construction but archaeology presented as innovation. Now we must examine what was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, because understanding what burned is essential to understanding what appeared 20 years later. The official story of the fire is simple. It started in a barn, spread rapidly through wooden structures, and devastated the city. But when we examine the destruction patterns, anomalies emerge. The fire destroyed the most architecturally advanced sections of Chicago while leaving less developed areas largely intact. It consumed stone buildings while wooden structures nearby survived. It burned structures that should have been fireproof while sparing those that should have been vulnerable. This is not how fires behave naturally. This is how fires behave when they are directed, controlled, and used to target specific buildings. Pre-fire photographs of Chicago show a city far more developed than official history admits. Multi-story stone buildings with classical design elements, advanced infrastructure, architectural sophistication suggesting a much older and more established urban center than a frontier town barely 40 years old. Then the fire comes, and when the smoke clears, these advanced structures are gone. The Chicago that emerges from the ashes is presented as new construction, but the rapidity of rebuilding suggests restoration rather than development from nothing. What if the 1871 fire was not an accident, but a reset? A controlled burning of structures that contradicted the official timeline of American development? Buildings that were too old, too advanced, too sophisticated to fit the narrative of westward expansion and frontier settlement. The fire provided cover. It allowed the destruction to be blamed on accident rather than policy, and it created the perfect justification for rapid rebuilding that could actually be excavation and restoration of buried or damaged pre-existing architecture. Then comes 1893, and suddenly Chicago unveils buildings that look exactly like the ones that supposedly burned in 1871. Classical design, advanced engineering, sophisticated ornamentation. But now they are labeled temporary exhibition halls, constructed quickly from plaster, destined for demolition. Why? Because admitting they were permanent, ancient, and excavated would raise questions about what Chicago really was before the fire. Questions about who built these structures. Questions about when. Questions that would undermine the entire narrative of American history. The buildings themselves contradict every claim of temporary construction. Let us examine the evidence structure by structure, photograph by photograph, because the architecture does not lie even when the official records do. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building was the centerpiece of the Exposition. It measured 1,787 feet long, 787 feet wide, and covered 31 acres under a single roof. The roof structure alone weighed 17,000 tons. It was supported by iron trusses spanning 364 feet, the longest clear span ever achieved at that time. The building contained no internal supports, creating an entirely open interior space. This is not temporary construction. This is engineering that pushed the absolute limits of 1890 technology. The truss design required precise calculation, advanced metallurgy, and construction techniques that challenged even permanent buildings. Yet we are told it was built in months and demolished within a year. The waste is irrational. The timeline is impossible. Unless it was not built at all. Unless it was already there. Photographs of the building's foundation show massive concrete and stonework sunk deep into bedrock. This is permanent foundation construction. No temporary exhibition hall requires or receives foundations of this depth and quality. The structural system, visible in construction photographs, shows iron frame technology consistent with buildings designed for century-long service. not seasonal display. The architectural detailing, the ornamental elements, the finish quality, all suggest permanence, contradicting claims of disposability. The Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, is the only major exposition building that survived demolition. Why? Because it was too obviously permanent to destroy without raising questions. Its construction is stone and brick, not plaster and wood. Its foundation is engineered for centuries of use. Its architectural integrity proves it was never temporary. Yet official history insists it was built for the Exposition, built in less than 2 years, built with techniques and materials indistinguishable from permanent classical architecture. The contradiction is glaring. Then there is the Transportation Building. Its golden doorway, an enormous arched entrance covered in gold leaf, displayed craftsmanship requiring months of specialized labor. The interior spaces showed finish work, acoustic design, and environmental control suggesting long-term functionality. Photographs of its so-called construction show a building being cleaned and restored, not built from nothing. Yet within months of the fair's closing, it was demolished, destroyed completely, buried. Why destroy something you just spent fortunes and years to build, unless you did not build it, unless it was evidence that needed to be erased? Every major building tells the same story: advanced foundations, permanent materials, construction quality inconsistent with temporary status, and rapid demolition that seems less like removal of disposable structures and more like systematic erasure of evidence. The official timeline requires us to believe that Chicago built in 2 years what would take decades today, then immediately destroyed it all. The timeline is not merely improbable, it is architecturally impossible, unless the buildings were already there. Now we must examine the technology displayed at the Exposition, because this is where the cover-up becomes undeniable. The fair showcased electrical systems, power generation, and energy transmission techniques that official history claims were experimental, primitive, or decades away from practical application. Yet there they were, fully operational, demonstrated to millions, and then quietly suppressed. Nikola Tesla displayed wireless power transmission at the Exposition. He demonstrated remote control. He showed electrical systems that harvested energy from the atmosphere. George Westinghouse provided alternating current power to the entire fairgrounds through a system that should not have existed at that level of development in 1893. The electrical illumination of the White City used more light bulbs than existed in the entire rest of the United States combined. This was not experimental technology. This was mature, fully developed infrastructure. Infrastructure that suggests the technology was not invented for the fair, but rather revealed for the fair. Displays showed electrical devices that would not be commercially available for decades. Wireless communication, remote sensors, automated systems. Some exhibits demonstrated technology we struggle to replicate even today, and all of it was framed as cutting-edge innovation, new inventions displayed for the first time. But what if it was not new? What if it was recovered? What if the Exposition was a carefully controlled revelation of suppressed technology, presented in a context that allowed public viewing while maintaining the fiction of recent development? After the fair closed, much of this technology disappeared. Patents were seized, inventions were classified. Researchers who displayed revolutionary devices at the Exposition found their funding cut, their work suppressed, their discoveries ridiculed or ignored. The fair was not just a showcase, it was a sorting operation, a way to identify which technologies the public would be allowed to keep and which would be buried. Tesla's wireless power transmission was demonstrated successfully in Chicago. Within years, his funding was cut, his towers destroyed, his work marginalized. Why? Because wireless free energy undermines the entire economic structure of centralized power distribution. If the technology worked in 1893, if it was demonstrated publicly, why was it not developed further? Unless it was too dangerous to the interests that controlled energy infrastructure. Unless the Exposition was used to identify and suppress technologies that threatened existing power structures. The machinery hall displayed devices that supposedly represented the cutting edge of industrial engineering. But workers who examined the machines reported finding manufacturing techniques inconsistent with 1890 capability. precision tolerances that should not have been achievable, materials that seemed more advanced than contemporary metallurgy, design elegance suggesting long development rather than recent innovation. Some researchers quietly suggested the machines were not new, but recovered, restored examples of older technology being presented as modern to hide their true age and origin. Even the planning of the electrical systems suggests prior knowledge. The power distribution network for the fair was designed with capacity and redundancy, far exceeding the supposed needs of temporary exhibition halls. The infrastructure included underground conduits, substations, and switching systems appropriate for a permanent city, not a 6-month event. Why build such robust systems for temporary use? Unless the systems were not built for the fair. Unless they were already there, part of pre-existing infrastructure that was being reused. The demolition of the exposition buildings began even before the fair officially closed. By 1894, crews were actively destroying structures. The official explanation was that the buildings were temporary and needed to be removed. But the demolition was systematic, thorough, and strangely urgent. Buildings were not simply dismantled. They were burned, buried, and obliterated. Materials were not salvaged for reuse, as would be economically rational. They were destroyed completely. Eyewitness accounts describe demolition crews working with unusual haste. Some workers reported being instructed to bury rather than salvage materials. Others described discovering foundation systems far deeper and more extensive than temporary buildings would require. Foundations that crews were ordered to break up and bury rather than preserve. Photographs of the demolition show buildings being burned that appear to be stone and brick, materials that should not burn. Yet smoke and flames engulf structures that official records claim were plaster and wood. The speed of destruction is telling. Within a year, almost all trace of the White City was gone. A metropolis that supposedly took 2 years to build was erased in months. The efficiency suggests pre-planning. The thoroughness suggests intent beyond simple removal of temporary structures. This was not cleanup. This was erasure. Systematic elimination of physical evidence. Some buildings were spared, but always with alteration. The Palace of Fine Art survived, but was stripped of many original elements. Interior spaces were modified. Architectural details were removed or changed. The building that remains is not identical to what stood during the exposition. It has been sanitized, altered to remove evidence of its true age and origin, preserved as a monument but neutered as evidence. The grounds themselves were transformed. Areas that had been excavated during fair preparation, areas where workers reported finding buried structures and tunnels, were refilled and landscaped. The topography was deliberately changed to obscure what had been revealed. Jackson Park, where the fair was held, was reshaped so completely that comparing pre-exposition, exposition, and post-exposition maps shows discontinuities that cannot be explained by normal construction and demolition. Why this level of destruction? If the buildings were truly temporary, simple disassembly would suffice. Salvage materials, reuse components, recycle infrastructure. This is economically rational, but that is not what happened. Instead, we see burning, burial, and obliteration. We see active efforts to ensure nothing survived intact. This is the behavior of concealment, not cleanup. This is what you do when the existence of something is more dangerous than its destruction is wasteful. When we assemble the evidence, the construction timeline that defies modern capability, the architecture that contradicts claims of temporary materials, the technology that should not have existed, the fire that suspiciously destroyed advanced buildings 20 years earlier, the systematic demolition that seemed desperate to erase all traces, a single explanation emerges that resolves every anomaly. The 1893 Exposition did not build the White City. It excavated, restored, and displayed buildings that already existed. Buildings damaged or buried during the 1871 fire and its aftermath. Buildings that were remnants of Tartarian civilization, a pre-existing advanced culture that occupied North America long before the official timeline of American settlement admits. The fair was both revelation and cover-up. It allowed the public to see these magnificent structures one last time, but framed as modern construction to prevent questions about their true origin. It demonstrated advanced technology, but attributed it to contemporary inventors to hide the fact that much of it was recovered rather than developed. And it created the perfect justification for destroying everything afterward, claiming buildings designed to be temporary needed to be removed, when in truth permanent evidence needed to be erased. This explains the construction timeline. You can excavate and restore in 2 years what would take decades to build from scratch. This explains the architectural quality. The buildings were not temporary because they were never built to be temporary. They were centuries-old structures being cleaned up and presented as new. This explains the technology. It was not cutting-edge innovation, but recovered capability from a fallen civilization that understood energy science we are only now rediscovering. This explains the 1871 fire. It was a reset, a controlled destruction of Tartarian buildings that were too obvious, too advanced, too contradictory to the official narrative. The fire cleared the way. Then the Exposition provided a controlled reveal, a moment when some structures could be shown to the public with a false backstory attached. And finally, the demolition completed the erasure, removing what the fire had missed and what the Exposition had temporarily preserved. The White City was white because the buildings were covered in centuries of accumulated dirt and needed to be cleaned for public display. The neoclassical style was not an aesthetic choice by American architects, but the actual design of Tartarian structures built long before. The advanced infrastructure was not newly installed, but pre-existing systems being reactivated. And the demolition was not removal of temporary buildings, but destruction of permanent evidence. But the 1893 Exposition was not unique. It was part of a pattern. World's fairs and expositions across the late 1800s and early 1900s followed identical patterns. Impossibly rapid construction, advanced architecture presented as temporary, display of suppressed technology, systematic demolition afterward. Paris in 1889, Buffalo in 1901, St. Louis in 1904, San Francisco in 1915. Each fair featured buildings that contradicted official timelines. Each demonstrated technology that disappeared after public viewing. Each was demolished with suspicious thoroughness. These fairs served a function. They were controlled reveals. Moments when the public could see remnants of Tartarian civilization, but under conditions that prevented recognition. The buildings were framed as modern achievements, recent construction showcasing progress. The technology was attributed to contemporary inventors, cutting-edge development rather than recovered knowledge. And the demolition ensured that physical evidence did not survive to be examined by future generations who might ask uncomfortable questions. The fairs were also testing grounds, opportunities to gauge public reaction to advanced technology, to identify which innovations could be safely released and which needed to remain suppressed, to measure how much truth the population could handle before it threatened the official narrative. The expositions were experiments in controlled disclosure, carefully managed to prevent awakening too many to the reality of what had been lost and what was being hidden. Some visitors sensed something wrong. Letters and journals from exposition attendees described feelings of disorientation, of seeing buildings that felt ancient despite being labeled new. Some described dreams and visions while at the fairs, experiences of remembering something they should not know. Others reported that the electrical demonstrations affected them strangely, producing sensations and perceptions beyond what the displays were supposedly designed to create. These testimonies were dismissed as overactive imaginations or publicity stunts. But they were genuine experiences of people encountering technology and architecture that resonated with suppressed ancestral memories. Workers who participated in construction and demolition occasionally spoke out. They described finding tunnels extending far beyond fair boundaries. They reported discovering artifacts and objects during excavation that were confiscated by authorities. They mentioned seeing foundation systems that connected buildings in ways suggesting the entire complex was designed as an integrated whole, not assembled piecemeal for an exhibition. These workers were told to stay silent. Some were threatened. A few disappeared. The official record erased their testimonies, but fragments survive in private letters and family stories passed down through generations. Photographers documented everything they were allowed to document. But gaps exist in the photographic record. Certain areas were restricted. Certain processes were not permitted to be photographed. Some images that were taken disappeared from archives, leaving only catalog entries indicating they once existed. What did these missing photographs show? What was so sensitive that even visual documentation had to be suppressed? We can only infer from the patterns of what remains and what is conspicuously absent. What happened to the civilization that built these structures? Where did Tartaria go? The evidence suggests a global catastrophe sometime in the 1800s, possibly around the mid-century. A disaster that decimated populations, buried cities, and disrupted civilization to such a degree that survivors lost continuity with their own past. When recovery began, those who took control rewrote history. They claimed the ruins as recent construction. They attributed recovered technology to contemporary invention. They organized the timeline to erase the gap, to hide the reset, to prevent the population from realizing how much had been lost, and how recently. The world's fairs were part of this rewriting. They served as transition points, moments when old world architecture could be displayed one final time before permanent removal. They allowed surviving Tartarian structures to be shown to a new generation that no longer recognized them, that accepted the official story of modern construction and temporary exhibition. And then, once the public had seen and marveled and moved on, the evidence was destroyed, the buildings erased, the truth buried beneath official narratives that grew more solidified with each passing year. By the early 1900s, the erasure was nearly complete. The remaining Tartarian structures were either destroyed, relabeled as colonial or Victorian, or so thoroughly modified that their origins became unrecognizable. The technology demonstrated at the fairs was either classified, suppressed, or carefully released in controlled ways that obscured its true source. The population was educated in a history that erased the reset, that presented a smooth progression from primitive past to modern present, that denied any break in continuity. Those who remembered were silenced. Those who questioned were marginalized. Those who preserved evidence were monitored and neutralized. Within 2 generations, living memory of the pre-reset world faded. The official timeline became the only timeline, and the fairs transformed from controversial erasure operations into nostalgic historical footnotes, remembered for their charm and innovation, but stripped of their true significance as the final public viewing of a lost civilization. We have examined the evidence, the impossible construction timelines, the architecture that contradicts temporary materials, the advanced technology that should not have existed, the systematic demolition that destroyed rather than salvaged, the 1871 fire that suspiciously cleared the way, the pattern repeated across multiple world's fairs, the testimonies that were suppressed, the photographs that reveal what the records deny. The conclusion is unavoidable. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition was not what official history claims. It was not a celebration of modern progress, built from scratch in 2 years. It was the final public display of Tartarian architecture, excavated from Chicago's buried past, restored for temporary viewing, then systematically destroyed to complete the erasure of evidence that a more advanced civilization had preceded the official timeline of American development. The White City was white not because of aesthetic choice, but because ancient buildings needed to be cleaned. The buildings were magnificent, not because architects suddenly achieved brilliance, but because they were inheriting designs from a superior predecessor. The technology was advanced not because inventors leaped forward, but because recovered knowledge was being carefully revealed. And the demolition was thorough, not because temporary structures needed removal, but because permanent evidence needed destruction. We live in the aftermath of this erasure. We are taught a history that has been rewritten to hide the reset. We accept timelines that contradict physical evidence. We celebrate innovations that were actually recoveries. And we look at photographs of the White City and see a triumph of modern engineering rather than the last glimpse of what was lost. But the photographs remain. The architecture that survived can still be analyzed. The testimonies that were suppressed can still be found by those willing to search. The evidence exists for those with eyes to see. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once you understand what the expositions really were, every World's Fair photograph, every official explanation, every timeline becomes transparent. The lie becomes visible. The truth emerges from beneath a century of narrative control. The 1893 Chicago Exposition was the final display. The last moment when the public could stand inside Tartarian architecture and feel its power, its presence, its proof of what came before. After that, the erasure was complete. The buildings were gone. The technology was suppressed. The memory was erased. And we were left with a carefully constructed history that denies we ever lost anything, that insists progress has been continuous, that claims our civilization is the first to achieve what our ancestors knew generations ago. But the White City stands in photographs, frozen in time, waiting for those who will look closely enough to see past the official story, waiting for those who will question why such magnificence was destroyed so quickly, waiting for those who will recognize that what was labeled temporary was actually eternal, that what was called new was actually ancient, and that what was demolished was evidence too dangerous to preserve. The Exposition was not a beginning. It was an ending. The final chapter in the suppression of Tartarian truth. The last public viewing before total erasure. And if we do not recognize what it really was, if we accept the official narrative without question, then the erasure will be complete. The memory will die. And with it, any hope of reclaiming what was lost. But we remember. We question. We examine. We refuse to forget. And in that refusal, in that questioning, the truth survives. Not in official records that can be rewritten. Not in archives that can be purged, but in the evidence they could not destroy. In the photographs that preserve what they demolished. In the timelines that do not add up. In the architecture that contradicts the lies. In the technology that should not have existed. In the patterns repeated across every World's Fair. In the testimonies that were suppressed but survived. The White City fell, but its images endure. And in those images, if you look closely, you can still see the truth they tried so desperately to bury.